attention to the man with no microphone. Good evening, everybody. Thank you all for coming down tonight. We are live from Books and Books in Coral Gables, Florida, through the generous support of the Knight Foundation. So a note to our internet audience watching at home, if at any time you'd like to purchase a copy of tonight's book, we can ship it to wherever you are in the United States, free of charge. Just call the number on the screen. This evening, Books and Books is honored to welcome Ms. Val McDermid, presenting her latest novel, Splinter the Silence. Ms. McDermid is the best-selling author of 29 previous novels, which have been translated into over 40 languages. She has won numerous awards over the course of her exceptional career, including the Crime Writers Association Gold Dagger and Cartier Diamond Dagger Awards, the Los Angeles Times Book of the Year Award, and the Pioneer Award from Lambda Literary. In this book, she brings us the latest installment in her beloved series featuring psychologist Tony Hill and former police detective Carol Jordan. Splinter the Silence is a gripping story centered on the mysterious deaths of several women who are the victims of vicious cyberbullying. But rather than have me give away any more of her plot, please give a very warm welcome to Ms. Val McDermid.
Thank you. And thank you for coming out tonight to hear me talking about the book. But before I go on to talk about the book itself specifically, I just want to say I spent the weekend in Boston with librarians, and those librarians really do know how to party. But what it also made me do was think a lot about sort of my own writing process, or how I got to where I am today. And I would not be a writer if it wasn't for the public library system. I grew up in a small town in Scotland, the heart of the Fife coalfield. My grandfathers were both miners. My dad worked in the shipyard. We're a very working class family. There wasn't much money to spare, and there certainly wasn't money for books because that was a luxury we couldn't afford. But my parents were of the generation of the Scottish working class that understood that the way to make sure your kids had a better life was through education. And so they encouraged me to read. My mum used to take me to the library before I could actually read, and she'd read me picture books. I couldn't even say library back in the early days. I used to say we were going to the Labrador. My mother reckoned I'd been going to the dogs ever since. But the best thing they did for me was when I was about 6 years old, we moved house to live opposite the Central Library. And that became my home from home. Pretty much every night after school, I would go over to the library and choose some more books because I would have read the books that I'd got the night before. It was always most tough at the weekends because getting the books to last me through a whole weekend could be difficult. I read very quickly from an early age. And the thing about the Scottish library system back in those days was that although you could take out 4 books at the same time, 2 of them had to be non-fiction. Heaven forfend you should have pure, unmitigated pleasure. There had to be virtue in there somewhere as well. But the result of that, of course, was that I ended up reading all sorts of things that I wouldn't otherwise have read. History, geography, natural history, and indeed poetry and drama, which were for some reason considered to be non-fiction, which doesn't say much about the imaginations of the poets and the dramatists. But the books that I came to love over the years were series novels, a series of books. So everything like Enid Blyton, Nancy Drew, Billy Bunter, Biggles. And I liked the fact that you're always revisiting old characters again and making their acquaintance again. But there was one series of books in particular that won my heart. And it was a series of girls' school stories. They were written over a period of about 40, 50 years, and there are about 59 volumes in the series. And these were the Chalet school books, and they were written by a woman called Eleanor M. Brentdyer. And these books were set in a girls' boarding school, initially in Austria and then later in Switzerland. And there are many interesting things about these books, but one of the things that was absolutely key for me was that this was a series where events had an impact people grew up in the course of these books. So every book covered either a term or a year in the life of the school. So you would encounter characters when they first came to the school at maybe 11 or 12 years old. You would see them grow up through their adolescence, through their teens, and then they would leave school and go on to have an adult life. And this, to me, was quite unlike all the other books that I read, because, Nancy Drew never grows up. The famous five, it's always the same eternal summer. And they seem to have forgotten that last week they were kidnapped. and the thing about the Chalet School books was that things had consequences. If you had a terrible tobogganing accident, you were still limping 3 books later. And I was intrigued by that. And I loved the sense of growing up with the characters and watching them grow and change. And that things happened that had weight in their lives. So that was one of the very important lessons I learned from these books. But I did learn some other vital lessons too. And one of them was that writing was a job that you got paid money for. This was a revelation to me. I mean, I don't know what I had thought, how I'd thought the books arrived in the library before, but there was one of the characters in the Chalet School books who grew up, left the school and became a writer and clearly got paid money. I thought, I could do that. I can tell lies. I could be a writer. And so from really a very early age, probably about 9 or 10, I had formed the ambition that was what I was going to do. I was going to make stuff up and tell stories, entirely because of discovering that this was a proper job. And there was one other crucial respect in which the Chalet School books changed my life. Where I grew up in quite a parochial part of Scotland, a place called Fife. And it's an area that's quite geographically cut off, even though it's right in the central belt of Scotland. To the north we have the Firth of Tay, and to the south we have the Firth of Forth. And until we got the road bridges in the 1960s, it was you actually had to make an effort to go to Fife. You didn't just accidentally go there. You didn't pass through on your way to somewhere else because there wasn't anywhere to pass through to. So we were quite, in some respects, quite inward-looking. We were politically quite radical, but socially quite conservative. And it was very much the way it worked was you went to high school, and then if you were really smart, you went to Edinburgh University or St Andrews University. And if you weren't quite so smart, you went to Dundee or Stirling. And then you came back to Fife to work. And I already knew in my teens that I wanted a wider horizon. This came from reading all these books, I think. And so I didn't want to go off to Edinburgh or St Andrews and then come back to Kirkcaldy, where I grew up, to spend the rest of my life. I wanted something different. I felt like an outsider. I felt like I needed somewhere with broader horizons, bigger skies, better possibilities. And having read the Chalet School books, I knew that there were 3 institutions of higher learning. There was the Sorbonne in Paris. Now, I knew I wasn't going there because my French wasn't good enough. And there was Oxford University, and there was the Kensington School of Needlework. You can tell, can't you? The shirt's not been ironed. It wasn't going to be the Kensington School of Needlework. And so I decided to go to Oxford University, and that was the thing that really did change my life. It opened all sorts of doors for me, all sorts of opportunities. It still opens doors for me today, all these years later. But of course, I decided in the course of this that I was still going to be a writer, but I knew you had to get a proper job because you couldn't just be a writer. So I left university and started work as a journalist, not because it was anything to do with writing as such, but more because it was the only job I could think of that actually fitted my temperament. I've never been very good at hierarchies, at rules and regulations, and so something like the civil service was not ever going to be for me. And I get bored very easily, so I knew I couldn't do something that was the same thing day in, day out. And journalism seemed to me to be the only thing I could find that fit the categories of having the variety to keep me entertained, and also having a certain amount of freedom and not being told what to do all the time. And so I became a baby journalist, and I started working down in Devon on a chain of weekly newspapers where I did a lot of parish council meetings and cricket matches. Cricket, a game about which I know even less than I know about American football. In the evenings, I was writing the great English novel because I was going to be a great literary novelist. Because you know what it's like at 20, you know the secrets of the universe. No one can tell you anything when you're 20 because you know it all. So I wrote this first attempt at a novel, which was full of all the big human emotions, love and hate and jealousy and betrayal and rage and grief and all these things. I'm sure you know the kind of thing. Somebody has to try and kill themselves in the second to last chapter. And so the one thing I will say about this book was I finished it, and I started sending it off to publishers. And I'm sure you've heard the stories of people with an early career sending books out to publishers, and time goes by and the book eventually comes back with the sort of hopeful letter that says, there's many things we liked about this book, but it's not quite right for our list at the moment, but should you write another book, please let us see it. I didn't get letters like that. My book came back to me practically by return of post. And I think by the end I was actually getting letters from people I hadn't sent it to. We've heard about this book, please don't. But I showed it to a friend of mine who's an actor, and she still to this day won't tell me whether she was being diplomatic or sincere. But she said, I don't know much about books, but I think this might make a good play. And I thought, a play, that's easy. Just cross out all the descriptions, leave in the dialogue. It's a play. So essentially that's what I did. And I wrote some extra scenes to cover the bits I'd crossed out, and took it off down to the local theatre. And the director of the local theatre company said, I'm looking for new plays by new writers to do a season in the studio theatre. This is perfect. And so entirely by accident, I was a professionally performed playwright by the age of 23. And I thought, this is it. It's like I'm going to be the new Harold Pinter, because I could do pauses. But it was not to be. Hollywood did not come calling, or the National Theatre. And the problem that I had really was that I didn't know what I'd done right, so I couldn't replicate it. I didn't know enough, I didn't understand enough about the nuts and bolts of dramatic construction to repeat that early success. So I kept trying to write these terrible plays. And my agent eventually fired me. So that really is rock bottom. Agent fires you. But I thought I was still determined that I was going to be a writer, that I had something to say worth listening to. And I'd figured out by this stage that where I was going wrong with the plays was that I didn't know what the hell I was doing. And so I thought, maybe I need to think about writing something where I do understand how it works. And ever since my childhood, I had read crime fiction, I'd read mystery novels. Mostly, I think, because, veterinary surgeons will tell you that an animal will imprint itself with whatever species it's brought up with. And I think that my grandparents only had 2 books in the house. One was the Bible, of course, and the other was, for some reason no one's ever been able to explain, The Murder at the Vicarage by Agatha Christie. And you apparently only need a reading age of 9 to be able to read Agatha Christie, because her prose is very clear and very lucid, and her sentence constructions are very straightforward. And so I used to read this and reread this and reread it yet again whenever I ran out of library books over the weekend or over a school holiday. I think by the time I was about 12 years old, I could recite the first chapter as a party piece. And I loved the intricacy of the book. And this is the first Miss Marple novel. And it is, I think, Agatha Christie writing at the peak of her powers. It's beautifully crafted. It's very cleverly put together. And I just loved it. And I was delighted to see from the inside cover of this book that Agatha Christie had written more than one book. I thought that was good. And so I made it my goal, my ambition to read the rest of these books. But then I ran into a problem, because the books were in the adult library. And back in those days, it was not like it is now, where you walk into the library and everything's on open shelves and you can take whatever you want from the shelves. And you can read The Exorcist when you're 5 years old if you want. But back then, there were all these books in the adult library that you weren't allowed anywhere near. The children's library was walled off. There was a locked door between the children's library and the adult library. I think it would have been easier to get over the Berlin Wall than to get into the adult library in Kirkcaldy. But I was determined, and the only answer I could come up with was to actually embark upon a life of crime. And I stole my mother's library tickets. And I went to the library, and I don't know if you've ever seen the Shrek movies, the Puss in Boots character with the big pathetic eyes. And I would stand there and do, I have to get a book for my mum. She's not well. And it kept me going for years. I read my way through the entire crime stock of Kirkcaldy Library on the basis that my mum was not well. But if you've ever read any of my standalone novels, you'll know that I have a conviction that you never escape the sins of the past, that the past casts a long shadow. And indeed, this proved to be the case. And some years ago, I was doing an event at Kirkcaldy Library, and my mum still lived across the road from the Central Library, so she came with me for the event. And surprisingly, a couple of the librarians were still there from when I was a kid. You know, I thought they were ancient, but they were probably about 23. So I introduced my mother, and one of them looked quite shocked. She said, "Oh, Mrs. McDermid, I thought you must be dead." And I went, "Dead? Why would I be dead?" The librarian said, "Well, with you being a bedridden invalid all those years." And I'm like, "No." You know. So that really was the start of my love affair with crime fiction. So I decided when I had failed at everything else that I should write a crime novel because I understood how a crime novel worked. You know, you've got to have a dead body. You've got to have some kind of detective. You've either got to have lots of suspects or no suspects at all. And then at the end, you've got to have some sort of resolution. I thought, I can do that. It makes sense to me. And the book that really kick-started me was Sarah Paretsky's Indemnity Only. A friend of mine who had moved to America sent me it when it came out. And I thought this was so radically different from the village mysteries and the police procedurals that we were writing in the UK at the time. And it just excited me so much. You know, I thought here's a novel with an urban setting. I understand cities. I live in a city. It's not like a village with the retired colonels of the Indian Army, which we don't have in Scotland. And then it had a female protagonist who had the kind of life I understood. You know, she had a brain and a sense of humour, and she didn't have to get a guy in every time she needed to do some heavy detecting. And it had politics as well. It had social politics and personal politics, and I thought this is the kind of book I want to write. And that's what kick-started me into writing Report for Murder, my first novel, first crime novel. And I was really lucky here as well. And I think that's something that's sometimes overlooked in the literary career. I think you have to have three things. You have to have a modicum of talent. You have to be willing to work really hard. But sometimes you need a little bit of luck as well. And when I wrote Report for Murder, it was the right book in the right place at the right time. If I'd written that book 5 years earlier, there wouldn't have been the appetite in British publishing houses for a book that had things in common with the new wave of American writers that was actually selling books in British bookshops. Those the Sue Grafton, Sarah Paretsky, Marcia Muller, Barbara Wilson, people like that. And 5 years later, the market would have been saturated. So I was just in the perfect spot. And that's happened to me 2 or 3 times in my career. And it's not something you can calculate. It's not something you can plan for. Sometimes it just happens that the right book falls into the right person's hands at the right time. So I started off writing about a Scottish journalist, because that was what I knew about. And I went on to write a series of novels with a Manchester-based private eye. And I realised, I reached a point where quite early on, after my 4th book, I decided I could give up the day job. By that time, I was the Northern Bureau Chief of a national newspaper, which was a very well-paid job, with a great expense account and a company car and all of those things. But it was also a very demanding job, and I really was struggling to find time to write. So I decided, I did my sums on the back of an envelope and figured out that if I wrote 2 books a year, I could pay my bills and feed myself. And so I decided that it was now or never. If I didn't do this, I would hate myself when I was 50. So I thought, just do it. And I just did it, and it was mad. And everybody said I was mad. But I was doing just about okay. But I also discovered when I started writing full time that I couldn't write books back to back with the same characters, because I just got bored. You know, it's that old getting bored too easily thing. Because I was writing, after I'd given up the day job, I was writing the second Kate Brannigan novel right after the first one. Because when I'd been writing before, I'd always been writing lots of journalism in between, but now I was just writing the fiction. I was about 2/3 of the way through the second Brannigan novel, and I'm thinking, I hate this woman. I never want to see her again. You know, I wish she would fall under a bus. And I realised that what I needed to do was intersperse these books with other novels. And normally a book takes quite a long time in the head with me before I'm ready to write it. It starts with quite a small idea, and it takes a long time for me to work that small idea up into something that will sustain a whole novel. Sometimes it starts off with a wee story somebody tells me, an anecdote over dinner. Sometimes it starts with a throwaway line, something I hear on the radio. Or it might be a sort of tangent in a feature article or something. It's always tangents. It's always little things that make me go, oh, I didn't know that. And then I can follow that through with, well, what if they believed him instead of her? What if this had happened instead of that? So these things, I say, normally take quite a long time to develop in my head. But one day I was driving down the motorway, and suddenly, this whole story fell into my head, like, complete. I knew who the characters were. I knew what the crime was. I knew how it developed. I knew how it unfolded. And I literally had to pull over onto the hard shoulder of the motorway and write it down, because I was terrified that if I waited till I got home, it would have gone as quickly as it arrived. And that ended up being a book called The Mermaid's Singing. And it was completely different from anything I had written before. It was different in tone, it was different in style, it was different in content. I knew right from the start it wouldn't fit either of the series characters I'd created thus far. And it was very different from anything that anybody else was writing in the UK at the time. It was a serial killer novel with a profiler. There had been obviously quite a few successful novels like that in America, people like Thomas Harris, for example. But nobody was doing this in the UK. And I think part of the reason nobody was doing this in the UK was that our approach to psychological profiling is slightly different. And it's a bit harder to get your head round. In America, the tradition is you take FBI agents and you train them in behavioural science, and they do the profiling. But in the UK, what we have tended to do, what we've always done and still do, is that we approach practicing clinical psychologists, the people who deal with these disturbed people for real in their, of course, their professional life, and invite them to come and work with the police to draw up the profiles. And this has some advantages, but it also has some disadvantages, because immediately there's a kind of tension between the police officer and the psychologist coming in from the outside. The police are always wary of outsiders coming into their investigations and kind of telling them what to do as they see it. So I knew right away that if I was going to do this kind of book, there was already that creative tension there. Right from the start, there was something I could work with. But I had to find out how they did this job, what it actually involved. And as I was thinking about how I was going to write this book, by chance I was watching the local news one evening, and there was some interviewing a psychologist who did police profiling, and I'm thinking, yes! So I called him up the next day at his place of work, a secure mental hospital, and I said, I'd like to come and talk to you because I want to write a book about a profiler. And there was a sort of long silence, and he said, how do I know you're not a nutter? I said, good point. I said, well, why don't I send you a couple of my books and then you can decide. So I sent him a couple of the Kate Brannigan novels, and I heard nothing for weeks. I thought, he thinks I'm a nutter. And then eventually I got a phone call from him. He said, well, I've read your books, my wife's read your books, and we don't think you're a nutter. So that's good. So we met and we had lunch and we got on really well, and eventually over the course of some more meetings, he actually took me to his place of work and he showed me a couple of live profiles that he was working on for the police, and he showed me how he went about the business of constructing a psychological profile, and that for me was manna from heaven, and that has become the method of Tony Hill. The personalities are very different. He's nothing like Tony Hill. But it's his method that I have adapted for Tony's method. In fact, it's quite funny because those of you who've read the earlier books in the series will know that Tony has a sexual problem. He's impotent. And my friend, the profiler, said to me after a couple of the books, he said, can you not mention me in the acknowledgements anymore? I said, sorry, have I got something wrong? Have I embarrassed you professionally? He said, no, it's my wife. She gets fed up of all of her workmates saying, so your lad can't get it up anymore then. It's just like, oops, the law of unintended consequences came to smite me. So that was the arrival on the scene of Tony Hill and his police colleague, Detective Inspector Carol Jordan, or Detective Chief Inspector as she is now. I intended The Mermaid's Singing to be a standalone novel, but as I was writing it, it was clear to me that Carol and Tony could sustain more novels, partly because of their professional lives and the possibilities that were brought about by what they do, but also because of the personal relationship between them. The way I had constructed that right from the start offered me lots of opportunities to develop them and afflict them with terrible things over a series of novels. It's been quite a thorny and difficult road for the two of them. And I'm not quite sure why it is I visit such terrible things upon them, but it does make them more interesting. So, having written the first Tony and Carol novel, and as I say, having realised that I could do more interesting things with them, I've carried on writing the books, and this is the 9th book in the series. The first one was actually, it's the 20th anniversary of the first one last year. And they've been more or less written every couple of years, because again, I can't write 2 books with the same characters back to back. I think it's been very interesting for me. I didn't start off with some overarching idea that I was going to write a certain number of books in the series. I didn't start with A is for Alibi and think, I've got another 25 of these to go. I still have no overarching sense of how long this series is going to be or where it's going to end. I mean, it will end at some point because I will run out of stories to tell about them, or I will run out of possibilities for developing the characters any further. But so far, the way it's always worked is that when I come towards the end of writing one book, the idea of what the next one might be about and where the next one might go and what I can do with the characters starts to become sort of clear, and that's great because that means that in just over a year's time I'll be able to sit down and write another one because the ideas are starting to form. This one came about really in the way that many contemporary crime novels do, that it's got its roots in the world around us, the society around us, the things that afflict us. I think the crime novel has increasingly become the novel of social history. It's the novel that shines a light on society, that tells us how we live now. And I think that in the way that we go to Charles Dickens to find out what Victorian society was like and how people behaved and what people did, in 100 years' time, people are going to look at the best of crime fiction to find out who we were and how we lived and what we did and the choices we made and the societies that we had. In exactly the same way now. I mean, I know that I know I do this, and I'm sure many of you do too, that if you're going to somewhere new, you see if you can find a crime novel that's set there or thereabouts, so you can get a sense of the society and the values of that place that you're going to, whether it's Scandinavia or Italy or South America. There's lots of crime fiction available that does that thing of shining a light, telling you about the place that you're interested in finding out about. And so at the heart of this book is the place where many of us spend a lot of our time in cyberspace. And I've been very interested over the years in how we react to the online world, what it does to our behaviour as individuals and as groups. And while I was sort of contemplating this book, I became much more aware of the kind of cyberbullying and trolling that has been a feature of the internet and has increasingly become a very unpleasant feature of the internet. And I guess I became more aware of it because it was directly impacting on people that I know, friends of mine. And it's almost always directed against women. It's almost always horribly misogynist, and often the abuse is sexually based. It's vile, it's vitriolic, it's really horrible. And it has its, what provokes it is often the most insignificant of things. Someone I know in the UK, Caroline Criado Perez, she suffered terrible trolling, terrible abuse. I mean, showered with absolute volumes of vitriol because she suggested that it might be a good idea to have Jane Austen's image on a banknote. There, how scurrilous is that? How atrocious is that? You know, because we have a tradition in the UK of having the images of prominent scientists and writers and on our banknotes, so people like Charles Dickens, Charles Darwin, Walter Scott in Scotland. These are the images we have on our banknotes, and she thought it would be nice to have Jane Austen on a banknote. And you would have thought that she had, killed someone's dog or abused their child or had an affair with their husband or wife. It was shocking. And J.K. Rowling, who's a friend of mine, took the view during the Scottish referendum that she wanted Scotland to remain part of the UK, and she gave £1 million to the Better Together campaign. And she had torrents of abuse and really, really horrible stuff. It made me ashamed to be on the other side of the argument. I'm a grown-up. If I don't agree with what people say, I sit down and I talk to them, have a discussion with them. I've had conversations with Joe Rowling about the question of independence, and vigorous conversations where we have different views, but and agree on many things, but end up in a different place. That's how grown-ups behave. But it seems that for some grown-ups, that's not the response that comes first to mind. And I was interested in the idea of why these things happen, why people behave like this, why they feel that the cloak of anonymity gives them an unparalleled opportunity to be horrible. I thought, after the sort of second wave of feminism, that we'd all started to behave a bit better in terms of the relationships between the genders, between the sexes. But it seems that all we needed was a place to hide in order to be as nasty as we always were. And I thought, for me, it's one of these things I wanted to write about this because I think it's important, because I think it's something that obviously has its roots in something we're doing wrong as a society, something we need to address, something we need to think about. And that's one of the great joys of writing crime fiction now, is that you can write a novel that is entertaining and fascinating and is about the lives of the characters, because that's what makes a book work, is that the characters, you've got to care about the people in the book to follow it through to the end. You've got to be willing to go on that journey with them. You can do that, but you can still write about the things that matter to you, the subjects that matter to you, and incorporate them in a book. I want, when you read my work, I want you to be entertained. I want you to enjoy it. I want you to be thrilled. I want you to care about what happens to Tony and Carol. I want you to be excited by it. But I also would like there to be space for you to go away and think about it afterwards, for it to carry on reverberating inside your head as you sort of think about the consequences of what's happened and how these people got there. And as I say, ultimately it's about enjoying the book. But I like to think that crime fiction at its best can also make us think a bit about the world that we're living in. So I'm going to read a little bit from Splinter the Silence, just to give you a bit of a flavour of the book, and then there'll be an opportunity for you to ask any questions. And if nobody volunteers questions, I will just pick on you at random. So while you're reading, you can panic a bit. So, I'm going to read from the beginning of the book, because then I don't have to explain what's going on. The first section of the book is from the perspective of the person who is doing the bad things. And I should also say, just before I begin, probably that the book, the heart of the book, starts off with what appear to be suicides. But Tony Hill sees a pattern in these suicides that makes him wonder what's really going on here. Is it just that these women have been driven to kill themselves because they can't stand the level of bullying, or is there something more going on? So. Weekends were best. It was easy to avoid working then, so it was easier to watch the women he was interested in. Mostly they didn't go to work then either, so he had a chance to observe their routines and work out the best way to kill them. He was good at watching. His teachers and later his employers had always commented on his attention to detail, how he would never attempt a project until he'd weighed up the risks and the possibilities. The first time he'd killed, he reckoned he'd still been in a state of shock, but even then he'd been able to make a plan and stick to it. Afterwards, he'd understood that act had opened a door to a mission. Now, his mission had assumed central importance in his life. Like today, He hadn't quite made his mind up who was going to be next. He had a couple of names on his mental list, and he knew how he wanted to kill the chosen one. It was mostly a matter of figuring out whether the logistics would work. When you were planning on hanging someone, you had to be sure there was something to hang them from. And he was in no hurry. The latest one remained fresh in his mind, a source of deep satisfaction, perfectly executed. This one, though, she ticked all the boxes, but he wasn't going to be rushed into making a final decision. Not like the first time he'd gone out into the wild, as he liked to think of it. Sitting here now, watching a house where nothing was happening, it was thrilling to summon up the memory. Exciting, but unnerving too. So many ways it could have gone wrong. She'd been alone. It was so unexpected he'd forgotten how to walk and tripped over his feet. He grazed his knuckles against the brick wall, a rash of blood spotting the skin. He couldn't quite believe it, but she really was alone. No minder, no driver, no PA, none of the chattering bitches she used to get her validation from. Just her, jogging down the 5 steps from her front door to the narrow sweep of gravel that divided her unfairly lovely home from the street where the likes of him were exiled. He half expected the door to open again, one or more of her retinue to come blundering after her, running to catch up before she reached the gate. But no, there was nobody. Only her. He looked around wildly, his usual determination to blend in with the streetscape torn into confetti and scattered on the diesel breeze stirring the city air. But nobody was paying a blind bit of attention. Late afternoon in North London, nobody was paying any heed to anyone or anything outside their own tight little knot of concern, least of all to her. It wasn't as if she was recognisable beyond the Twitterati. To the average person in the street, she was simply another North London 30-something. Designer jeans and a fashion hoodie, hugging her unexceptional frame rather than hiding it. That year's must-have leather satchel slung across one hip. Multi-shaded blonde dye job caught back in a loose ponytail. Hardly worth a first glance, never mind a second one. Hard to believe anybody had ever taken any notice of anything she'd said or done. Oblivious to his confusion, she opened the heavy iron gate with the Gothic creak he'd grown familiar with lately. She closed it carefully behind herself and started walking. He couldn't quite believe it was happening. For 3 weeks he'd been keeping tabs on her whenever he could manage it, and she never ventured out alone. Running scared, he'd decided. Not scared enough to shut up, but scared enough to make sure there was always somebody around to watch her back. After the things they'd said to her the night before, she should have been hiding under the duvet, cowed into submission, not striding along the pavement, acting like she was the one with the moral high ground, instead of acknowledging the truth that she was a destructive, disruptive, dangerous bitch who deserved everything that was coming to her. He'd not planned on dealing with her today. He hadn't been expecting so golden an opportunity, but he wasn't going to let it slip away. Who knew when he'd get another chance like that? And it wasn't like he hadn't worked it all out in his head 100 times, testing every element of the plan for weak points and figuring out how to overcome them. Get a grip, he chided himself under his breath, falling into step behind her, a few meters and a couple of teenage girls between them. He knew it could be a long while till he got her alone again. Get a grip. There we go. Thank you. Thank you. So thank you. Well, it's kind of strange because I think whenever I look back at a piece of work, all I can see is the things that I don't like. The sentence I would rework, or the adjective that feels like the wrong adjective. I think every time you sit down to start a novel, you have this kind of platonic ideal in your head. You think this is the one where everything's going to go beautifully. The characters are going to be, they're going to capture people's imagination. The prose is going to be wonderful. The story's going to work like clockwork, and it's all going to be just wonderful. And it sometimes feels like every sentence you put on the page takes you further away from that ideal. And every book, for me, it's part of a learning process. It's a challenge. I try to make each book better, or at least different from the ones that have gone before it. and all I can see when I finished a book is the bits where I've failed to do what I wanted to do when I set out. But that's a good thing because that's what keeps me moving forward. You know, it's a bit like a shark. You've got to keep moving forward or die. Has anyone got any questions? Yes.
First of all, I'd like to thank you. We appreciate sharing all those intimate, moments of your life and how your creative process began. The importance of going to the library, being taken and reading and reading and reading. And how you really attribute the first thirst for reading and writing coming from that experience with your mother and going to the library and having books read to you.
I think,
It's fantastic. I've heard that so many
yeah.
times from people who do creative writing. It's just an impressive.
It's where you learn.
Over again.
It's where you learn your craft. You've got to be a reader before you're a writer. Yeah.
When you were at Oxford, did you take courses in creative writing and psychology?
No, but
Things that would have helped you with your
the things that would have helped me, that would have been really nice, but those were not available options. There was no creative writing courses at all in the university. I think there still are no creative writing courses in the university at Oxford. But no, I mean I read English because that was as I didn't know any better. But there was no official sort of creative writing stuff. It was just read and read and read, really. I mean, huge amounts of reading. People sort of sometimes laugh about how short the terms are at Oxford. It's only 3 8-week semesters in the year, but you write 2 essays every week. So the only way to do the volume of reading that's required is to spend your vacations reading, and that, I mean, for me that was no hardship, except when it was things I didn't particularly enjoy.
writing. When you received those papers back, you comments and all.
Hmm.
So even though they weren't creative writing quizzes, you would be
Yeah.
in essence how to.
Well, I mean, I think the thing I learned at Oxford more than anything was how to think. That's- Everything that you wrote was kind of tested again. You were not allowed to make any unsupported statement. When you wrote an essay, it was either handed in to be marked or it was read out in the tutorial. So you got instant responses.
Did being a reporter in any way also influence your writing? Because many writers have also started out doing journalism.
Mm,
Many Latin American writers, this was also one.
yeah.
They worked as journalists and then they moved into more creative.
Yeah, I think there were some things that I took away from journalism that have been very valuable to me, but I don't think it was actually the practice of putting the words on the page, in a sense. I mean, one of the key things I learned from journalism very early on is that you write the story when the news happens. You can't wander about the newsroom being precious and going, "Oh, I really don't feel like writing about the train crash today. I'll do it tomorrow. I'll probably be more inspired tomorrow." When the news happens, you have to write the story, and you learn very quickly that it might not be the best 1,500 words you've ever written, but you can get something down, and once you get something down, you can make it better. So when I come to the point of the year where it's time to sit down and write the new book, that's what I do. I sit down and write, and I sometimes sit down the next day and go through what I've done the day before and throw most of it away. But there's always something to bounce off of, something to move you forward. So that was a very important lesson to learn for me, not to be precious about it, not to sit about and wait for the muse to strike, but just to, this is what you have to do today. And the other thing that I gained from journalism, and is still incredibly valuable, is that I got snapshots of lots of different people's lives, usually at a time of crisis. But I went to places and I met people that would never have crossed my path otherwise. I saw them in their homes, I saw them in their workplaces, I saw them in the streets, and I talked to them and I heard their voices and I saw the way they lived. And that's still a huge database that I can draw on when I'm thinking about characters, when I'm thinking about what motivates people, why you do the things you do, what draws people together, what forces them apart, all of these things. It feels as if I've got that, that great sort of, card index in my head that I can flick through and and find a background for somebody that works in terms of what I need them to do in the book. So that was the huge advantage of being a journalist. I don't think I ever learned very much about sentence construction or how to write from that point of view, but I did get a lot of support for my from the early stages for that whole business of just getting on with it. Anybody else got questions? Yes. Mm. Well, I think books are the genuinely interactive form of entertainment, because every reader makes the book their own. I mean, we all do this when we read a book. We bring to it our own experience of the world. We paste onto the characters the faces of people we've known, or people we've met, or people we've seen. And that's why it's often such a shock when we see an adaptation in a film or a television. You know, the character, the actor they cast may be exactly the way the authors described them, but we go like, that's not him, that's not her, because we've created our vision and we've created our world within the book, and I think that's one of the things that you learn also as a reader. You kind of inject yourself into the stories. You imagine how you'd feel in that situation. You see what the characters are seeing, but it's through your experience of the world, so it becomes your very individual thing. And whatever you read, it's your book. You know, it's left my hands, and it becomes yours. It becomes your experience. And I think that's one of the great riches of books and reading, because it feeds your imagination. And, you know, I mean, I was an only child, so I spent a lot of time either being, you know, sort of having to listen to the adults being boring, or just being on my own. And books were the place where I went to live. That's where I had the most fun, generally. And those places that I visited as a child are still vivid. All these years later, I can still remember the excitement of reading Treasure Island for the first time. And just being swept away by this fabulous story and these fascinating characters. And that's when books work, that's what they do in spades. It's the escape. It's your.
I was going to ask you about the title of the book, of his book in particular.
Uh-huh.
Sort of very intriguing. And do you normally come up with the title while you're writing, after you've written the book?
I like to have the title in place before I start the book. The titles tend to come quite early on to me. It's almost something I can write towards, if that makes any sense at all. I like to have a sense of what the title is going to be, and it's quite important to me as I work through the book in progress. And sometimes publishers want you to change the title for whatever reasons. Some years ago, I wrote a book that, although it was a contemporary thriller, it was set against events of 200 years ago. It was about William Wordsworth, the poet, and Fletcher Christian, the mutineer of the Mutiny on the Bounty, who actually went to school together. And I put together this kind of reworking of history where I didn't change anything. I just coloured in the gaps. And in my head, the book was called The Bounty, because it had that great double meaning of you know, a prize, a treasure, as well as referring to the ship and the mutiny. And my publisher was like, no, we can't call it that. Can't call it that because we published a non-fiction book 3 years ago called Bounty, about the mutiny on the Bounty, and people will be confused. And I'm like, you know, I'm amazed often by how publishers underestimate the intelligence of my readers. You know, I don't think my readers would be at all confused between a crime novel called The Bounty and a non-fiction book about a 200-year-old mutiny called Bounty. Anyway, that was the slight problem that we had with that one. So I ended up calling it The Grave Tattoo. But in my head, it's still Bounty. You know, so it's, and in fact, the file on my computer where the text files are stored is still called Bounty. So it can be really quite important in for me in my head. The seventh Tony Hill and Carol Jordan novel features the return of a villain from the second novel. Second novel is called The Wire and the Blood, and it comes from a T.S. Eliot quote. It's about the trilling wire and the blood, something about the scars, the inveterate scars of long forgotten wars. And I wanted to call the seventh book, The Return of Jacko Vance, I wanted to call it The Inveterate Scars, as the sort of second half of the quote. And my editor sort of looked at me and said, how am I going to sell that to the supermarkets? And so I thought, okay, I'm not going to be allowed to call it that. So then I thought I'd call it Unredeemable. And the art department said, no, you can't call it Unredeemable because that's too long to get on the title page. So it ended up being called The Retribution, which was the third choice, really. So, yeah, it's something that sometimes changes in the process, and I'm never comfortable with that. Really, in my head, it's where I started from. And with this one, Splinter the Silence, I wanted to have the idea that what's going on inside these people's lives, these people's heads, when they are put in this place where they have this terrible torrent of abuse thrust upon them, and how it's about trying to get them to shut up. And these women won't shut up. These women in this novel will not be silenced, and so that's what they're doing is splintering the silence. And that was sort of where I was thinking about it at the beginning, and I think it got more vivid as I was going on with it. Really, I think that's often the way you start off with a title that's going to fit the book, and then it becomes it kind of has a life of its own, if that makes any sense.
Now I understand, 'cause I started reading it, and so she's in the car. So she's asking him questions. I'm like, why is she asking him questions? I don't understand that.
Yeah.
With them not being able to shut up.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's it. I mean, so a lot of us women are inconveniently vocal these days. When our mothers and grandmothers were expected to be silent, we've busted out of that. I think it is. It is. It's a new era, and it's a good one. I think so. I think everyone should be able to be heard.
Real quick question. You use mystery novel and crime novel interchangeably. Are they one and the same or not? I always say mystery novel. I never talk about
I think
they're one and the same, or are they different?
it's a cultural thing. I mean, in America, traditionally, you've talked about the mystery novel, and in the UK, we've talked about crime fiction.
Crime fiction.
Yeah, much more detective. We talked with detective fiction, and then it became more generically crime fiction. But I think often when people talk about mysteries, they mean they're talking more about what we call the cozy. I think that's yeah. Yeah, it's one of the funny things, isn't it? Because in the UK, we think of American crime fiction as being really quite hard-boiled and noir. But actually, the reality of American mystery fiction is that there's this huge mountain of cozy crime, which you guys love. And people like to think of the British crime fiction as being quite sort of cozy and Agatha Christie and village mysteries. And the reality is that most contemporary British crime fiction is quite dark and urban and noir, particularly that produced by my fellow countrymen in Scotland.
What do you think of the American detectives as they appear in these American mystery or crime?
Well, I think it's like every other thing. There's good ones and there's less good ones. You know. Yeah, I mean there are some.
The UK fiction, when it comes to this British novels and mysteries, in American crime, what do you call it, crime?
Mm. Yeah, it's always a matter of taste, isn't it? I mean, we're drawn, but we cleave to particular kinds of crime novel or mystery novel, depending on our own taste, our own experience of the world. Some people who read my books, some people can't read the Tony and Carol books because they find them too dark. But they love the standalones. Other people love the Tony Hill and Carol Jordan novels and find the standalones a little tame. So it's about taste. I try to cover the whole spectrum. Mm-hmm. Mm. Mm-hmm. Yes, sorry. It would be an absolute luxury to be able to stay at home for 3 months and write. But unfortunately, life doesn't work that conveniently. My life is quite geographically challenged anyway. So I do have workspace. I spend most of my time in Edinburgh. I spend some of my time in Manchester. I have workspaces in both of those houses. But I also spend quite a lot of time on trains. And I find trains are really conducive to writing. People generally don't, they can't really call you because on the train the reception comes in and out on the cell phone, And if you really don't want to have the conversation, you just go, "Oh, we're going into a ton." But I find I really like working on trains. Just get on the train, open up the laptop, and off I go. Yeah. And I mean, I have on occasion almost missed my stop. I've just realised, oh my God, we're coming into my station. So suddenly grabbing the laptop with one hand, grabbing the bag with the other hand, rushing off the train like a mad woman. I find airports and planes less conducive to writing. I think because you're on and off, and you're never as comfortable sitting in the plane as you are on the train with your laptop. But yeah, I'll trains, hotel rooms. Yeah. Well, I have appalling handwriting. If I write notes to myself, if I don't transcribe them onto the computer fairly quickly, and I come back to them a couple of weeks later, I have no idea. There's just words that are lost to me. I was looking at something that I was making some notes the other day, and I skimmed back in my notebook to something I'd written previously, and I'm looking at this sort of whole page of notes. I'm thinking, what in the name of God is this about? And I was really struggling with it. I was really puzzling with it, and then eventually I realised it was some notes I'd made during a workshop I was running. Some notes on what other people had been doing with the material we've been working on, and that suddenly made sense of some of it, but some of it is lost to me forever. And so that's kind of a slight problem for me. So yeah, I work straight onto the computer, which again I think is the journalism thing. Like you learn very quickly. You work straight onto the keyboard, the typewriter as it was in those days. No, not. I do some. We have a place in Scotland, Muniach Vor, which is a writers' centre, and people go there for a week at a time, and they're taught by there's a maximum of 16 people on the course, and you have 2 professional writers teaching the course for a week, and it's a mixture of tutorial and workshop stuff, and I do that every couple of years or so. I teach on that. But I always feel slightly fraudulent teaching because I think I don't think I know. I don't have any secrets to impart. It's the thing about writing is I always say there's no rules. The thing about it, you make your own rules. You have to figure out the stuff that works for you, the process that works for you, all sorts of. I mean, it's so individualistic. The processes that go into making a piece of work. I think you can help people make it better, but I don't think you can teach them how to write. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for your time. Thank you. That's great.
Okay, folks, so if there are no more questions, then a reminder to our internet audience watching at home. Still time for you to call the number on your screen, and we can send Splinter the Silence to wherever you are in the U.S. free of charge. For those of you here in the house, we have the book as well as many, many of Val's previous titles for sale over there at the counter in the front room. She's going to be signing here at the table to the left of the podium. And this has been such a wonderful presentation. Please give another hand to Val McDermid. Thanks very much. Thank you.